Everybody, welcome to another great BBM event. Eli Chavez Calderon here. I have the honor to have our great friends from Or Tzion and our friend Andre, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here representing Congregation Or Tzion and in partnership with Valley Beit Midrash. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Joel Poremba, who is a business attorney with more than 20 years of experience. He also has not a personal connection to my family, but a university connection. We have members of our family who are alumni of University of California at San Diego. And today, I'm personally encouraged to hear his discussion about the memoirs of his father and as a Holocaust survivor and how that has had an effect on him. So without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to our speaker today, Joel Poremba. Thank you all.
Thanks, Andre, and thank you to Valley Beit Midrash for having me today, and thanks for Alex and Eddie setting this up, and of course to Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz. I'm Joel Poremba, and I'm going to take you back when I was 13 years old at my bar mitzvah. So as I was delivering my Dvar Torah or bar mitzvah speech, I went ahead and boldly told the synagogue that my father was a Holocaust survivor and that one day I would share his story and do it in book form. The problem was I did not know my father's Holocaust story at all. 2 years later, the shul invited me back for an aliyah and to give a short update and give a short Dvar Torah. So during that speech, I again referenced my father's survival and said I would one day share it with everyone in book form. After the services, during the Kiddush, a regular shul goer came up to me and he said to me, I was at your bar mitzvah 2 years ago. I'm here today and I heard what you said both then and today. And I want to know, what have you done in the last 2 years to tell your father's story? I was 15 and I was fairly embarrassed. I had done nothing in that regard. Sure, I was only 15 years old, but it really occurred to me for the first time that you can't just say you're going to do something. You actually have to figure out what steps you need to take and then actually take those steps. Looking into the man's eyes as I made some silly joke about studying for my driver's exam, he patted me on the back and he walked right by me. He might as well have walked right through me because I was floored at not knowing what I did not know. And that is, I did not know how difficult it was going to be to sit down with my father and then share his story. So for the next 31 years, I chased my father around literally and figuratively to get him to open up and tell his story. But he would not, like many survivors. The one thing that I didn't understand, I went to Hebrew day school from kindergarten to ninth grade. So at least twice, sometimes 3 times a year, the private schools would bring in Holocaust survivors and they would share their stories and engage in a Q&A after. And I couldn't understand how it was that these men and women who had survived were so open and had such large personalities, warm personalities, and how it was that they were able to share their stories so what seemed easily, flawlessly. And then I'd go home and my father, who was a happy-go-lucky man, you couldn't get him to talk about World War II, the Holocaust, or growing up in Poland. Then fast forward to 1993, he actually agreed to go see Schindler's List with me. And afterwards, he let slip 2 personal events. He made reference to the Plaszow concentration camp that was featured in the movie and said I was there. And before I could even start asking questions, he skipped right to, hey, I used to sneak in and out of the Krakow ghetto under the cover provided by the very large group known today as the Schindler's Jews, except he said, I didn't know who they were, didn't know where they were going. just timed my coming and going to a large group coming and going so that no one could see me coming in and out of the main gate. After that, he clammed back up. But shortly after that, the Shoah Visual Foundation was created out of the movie. And as we all know, they went around the world taking everyone's testimony, recording it. And my father had a handful of survivor friends from Poland that lived in Los Angeles and would frequently come to the house. And all of them were like my dad. They didn't want to talk and they didn't want to revisit anything. But over the years, one by one, each one of these survivor friends of my father's booked their own appointments with the Visual History Foundation and had the crews over and gave their testimony and had it video and audio recorded. My dad was the last holdout, and he said he absolutely had no interest in doing it. Then in 1998, at my son's bris, afterwards, my dad came up to me and said, I booked the Shoah History Foundation to come to the house in October. I couldn't believe it. I don't know exactly what it was at that time that prompted him to finally agree to do it. But if I was a betting person at the time, I would have bet that he would have canceled it. But lo and behold, in October 1998, he sat down with the what is now known as the USC Shoah History Foundation and gave 4 hours of recorded testimony. So on that day, my father engaged in what can best be described as a liberation. After the exercise of spending over 7 hours with the crew, 4 of which were recorded, he wanted to start talking about the Holocaust. It was very difficult. He cried through almost all of it, but now he saw he could make it through, and he would talk about it with anyone in short spurts and in long sit-down conversations. I, on the other hand, went in the opposite direction. Because it was such a long day in the house, I grew restless. I started pacing at the back of the house, and the one door that separated us from where my father was being recorded was an old door that had slats in the middle of it, and you could easily hear what was going on in the next room. Unfortunately, the 2 times that I actually put my head to the door to listen in, I heard 2 stories that I'd obviously never heard before, and it absolutely, both of them, tore holes in my heart. Just briefly, which I describe in more detail in the book, I heard my father explain how in August 1942, when he was just 11, when all the rumors were going around about towns being deported and liquidated and people put on trains, no one knew if this was true or not. My father, at the age of 11, he had already had 2 years of experiences of believing rumors that were going around. He was suffocating and he wanted to run away, and he didn't ask my grandmother. He told her he was leaving. So that ended up being the last time he saw his mother. So to hear him transport himself back to that age in 1942 and describe how it was he said goodbye to his mother was heartbreaking. Then hours later, I heard my father tell the story about how when my dad's youngest sister was picked up by the Gestapo, she had been posing as a Christian Polish girl, as my father had been doing. And the Gestapo interrogated her, imprisoned her for several weeks, tortured her psychologically, emotionally, physically. And he broke down explaining all of that. And after hearing those 2 stories, I had decided I did not want any part of this. And I did not want to hear anything more, because I knew there was much worse. Because my father's family, over 400 members of my father's family on both sides were murdered during the Holocaust, and his parents and 3 out of his 4 sisters were slaughtered. So I definitely didn't want to hear anything more. The actual exercise of having the Shoah Foundation in the house was, at that time, not good for me, but very good for my father. It didn't occur to me that time was running out until just 2018, just 4 years ago, when I finally took my first trip to Israel with a group called Momentum Men. And I had no intention of really resolving these issues on this trip. Everything simply unfolded on its own. I came in contact with some amazing leaders on this tour, one of which was my own personal rabbi who accompanied all of us from Orange County, California, Rabbi Israel Siner. And one of the things that we discussed is I revealed to him that, as everyone understands, what survival guilt is. My father certainly had it. Why did I survive, but my family didn't? Why did I make it through, but other Jews who did much more than I did not? For me, as a second generation, I had something different that I called birth guilt. And that is this: I couldn't understand how it was that I was born, because if it wasn't for the Holocaust, I wouldn't have been born. Because what Jew living south of Krakow, which inarguably was the Jerusalem north of the world back in the 1930s, without the modern state of Israel, the center of the Jewish world, what Polish Jew would leave and come to the United States? Not many did, but it took the Holocaust, and it took my father an additional 6 years to get out of Europe to come to New York for that to occur. Obviously, he then met my mother in Los Angeles, and I was born. And it's always bothered me that I perceive myself as a product of the Holocaust. And when I explained this to my rabbi, he said, you have to change your manner of thinking. You are not the product of a tragedy. You are the product of your father's triumph. So the rest of my trip in Israel in 2018 went along those lines. I was forced to redefine how I had been feeling, what my connection was to the Holocaust, and my relationship with my father. So when I came back, it still took me another 6 months to reconcile how I was going to make good on my bar mitzvah promise. So in 2019, without announcing anything, I just sat down and watched 4 hours of my father's testimony. It was very difficult to get through. It took me 2 nights. Afterwards, I called my father up and I said, you're not going to believe it, but I watched the video. And he said, you are the only one who has watched it in the entire family, because no one wanted to, no one could. But after that, I said, I have questions. So we met for over 10 hours, most of which I recorded by audio. I took scrupulous notes and I put it aside. And truly, I wasn't still ready to face this. And I don't know. The truth is, if it wasn't for the COVID lockdowns, where I had absolutely nowhere to run and hide anymore, I don't know that I would have moved forward. But with everything locked down here in California, I finally started transcribing all the audio and all the video. And then I have my source material and I began digging in. And it was difficult, but I had a draft within the first 6 months that I showed my father. But interestingly, my father then fell ill in 2021, and it sort of became a race that I needed to get the book out and hand it to him physically, so he knew that it was done. And I was able to accomplish that. But as I'll explain later when I go through a brief slideshow, after my father passed in October, I dug back in and added 15 pages to the soft cover, and 13 photographs, which I consider to be evidence of various crimes against humanity committed in my father's town in Woliczka, Poland. And then I put out a hardcover edition with that extra content. So, one of the questions I get often is, how is it that your father survived? And without giving away the major themes of the book, it really started with what I call the 4 no's. After Kristallnacht in November 1938, right next door is Poland. And of course, the Jewish Polish community began wondering, is this going to happen here in Poland? Is Germany going to invade Poland? Are they going to put their Nuremberg laws on us? Should we leave? these discussions were had over the next 6 to 8 months. My father's family didn't say anything to each other until Passover 1939. And at that point, my grandmother said to my grandfather, why don't you take the 5 kids and go to New York? Just leave. I cannot, because my mother is feeble, and when she passes, I'll join the rest of you. Well, my grandfather said emphatically, no, I'm not leaving the family behind. I don't think anything bad is going to happen with Germany. When your mother passes, we'll revisit it then. Then September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland. And the first thing my grandmother said to my grandfather was, you need to leave. They're targeting men. At this point, no one said anything about Jewish men. It was just they're targeting military age men, both if they're resisting and fighting, or for labor to help in the German war effort. So you should run. And again, my grandfather said no. 6 days later, the Wehrmacht rolled into my father's town, Weliczka, which is just 8 miles southeast of Krakow. And again, my grandmother said, you need to go into hiding. They're going to round up men, I'm telling you. And at that point, Weliczka became known as a city of no men. Many of the Jewish men fled the town for the exact reason that my grandmother was encouraging my grandfather to do. But he was not going to abandon his family. My grandfather was not afraid of standing up to anti-Semites. He had been doing it for 15, 20 years in Weliczka, all of which I detail as a prelude to the Holocaust. He was not going to run from this either. 5 days later, after 5 days of roundups and humiliating events that occurred in Weliczka, which I'll share with you in a slideshow, my grandmother caught wind that the Germans and the Poles had put together some kind of a list and were rounding up men, Jewish men, on that list. And she said, for the 4th time, run to the forest. There aren't very many Jewish men here left. Go, just go. But my grandfather had already decided 3 times previous he was not going to abandon his family, so he didn't. And that led to my grandfather being rounded up, and with 31 other Jewish men. They were told publicly they were being taken out for the day for a labor job, and that they would be back by nightfall. But all the Jewish men were rounded up, taken to a forest, lined up, and gunned down. My father was 9 years old. His entire childhood was ended on that day, September 12th, 1939. And what did my father learn from this? He learned that whatever the Germans and the Poles say and do, that he should do the opposite. He watched his own father not run. He watched his own father stand in defiance. And even though my grandfather had taught my father when to fight and when to stand up and when not to, my father at the age of 9 just went into survival mode literally on that day, on September 12th, 1939. And he would spend the next 6 years running. And that is exactly what ended up saving him. Let me switch to the topic of trauma. I spent my entire childhood and early adulthood hearing about trauma to the children of Holocaust survivors. And I could never really wrap my head around it. I had what I would like to think a fairly normal childhood. There was nothing that I wanted for. And it just didn't make any sense to me. I had heard about trauma experienced by other second generation children, but I really couldn't see how that would apply to me. Well, that was a bit of naivete on my part, because once I opened up the proverbial Pandora's box and watched my father's Shoah Foundation video, it wasn't to the very end of the interview that something really dawned on me. At the end of the interview, the interviewer asked my father to sort of emote and start sharing various feelings. And a lot of anger came out, and most of it was directed at his Polish neighbors that participated in such high level anti Semitism and complicity with the Germans, which inevitably led to my grandfather being caught by the help of his Polish neighbors. But then at the very end of that, he said that the Nazis had stolen his childhood. And it then occurred to me that back when I was 13 years old, on a summer day, I was playing in the backyard with my brother and a very close friend. We were very into whatever it was that we were playing with. And my father came out and said goodbye because he was going to work. And neither of the three of us responded or even looked at him. He repeated, "Goodbye, guys. I'm going to work. Have a great day." And the three of us again ignored him. My father then turned to walk away, and I peeked up to see what his reaction was, and I saw nothing but his backside. He then looked over his shoulder and he said, "None of you would have survived." And I knew exactly what that meant. He was saying, none of you would have survived the Holocaust like I did. And I'm 13, so I couldn't really understand why he would say that, other than the obvious fact that we had ignored him. And I sort of took that on to myself because it really wasn't incumbent upon our close friend to break the silence and say goodbye. It wasn't really, I felt, on my brother, who was younger than me, to say anything. I felt responsible. And I carried that for quite some time. And then as I got older and I'm in college and I'm in law school, I thought, did the punishment really fit the crime? Did being told you would never survive really warrant being said if I had ignored my father as he was leaving for the day for work? And I concluded no. But I knew there was probably something more behind it. But as I buried all my feelings post 1998, when he gave the interview, I realized there's probably a lot I don't know and cannot explain. But after watching his video, things started to catch up with me. But then I realized when he said that in the video, that his childhood was stolen from me. My father didn't have his childhood. He had to survive his, whereas I played my way through mine. And I'm sure in that particular moment, as he was getting no attention, saying goodbye, he saw that how into our playing we were. And I'm sure it bothered him because he did not have that after the age of 9. So at that point, I realized that there was a lot more to the whole trauma suffered by second generation children. But I don't think I suffered it to any extent that other people did. Oddly enough, it wasn't until my dad's 80s. My dad died at 91 and a half. In his 80s, my mom would tell me that he would elbow her in the middle of the night and shout out. And then when he would wake up the next morning, he would explain to my mother that he was being chased by Germans and he was trying to get away. And in some dreams he was caught, and in other dreams he wasn't. And he just remembered being tied up and marched somewhere. So in bed, he was always flailing away. But this didn't happen until his 80s. So between that and the incident where he said, "I don't think none of you would have survived," I couldn't really remember anything else that had occurred in my childhood that could be classified as trauma foisted on a second generation, because I certainly didn't feel that way growing up. Not to take away from any other 2G kids who definitely did. Let me share with you. So this is the cover of this is the hardcover edition of the book, where I added 15 pages and 13 more photographs. This is the photograph that was beside my father's nightstand for my entire life. And at the age of 5, I went up to my dad and said, "Who are these people?" And he explained, that's my father and my mother on the left and right ends, and my three sisters in the background, and me in front is the only boy with my youngest sister. And I couldn't understand. I had so much family on my mother's side. Why is it these people weren't around? So my dad just said simply they were killed. And with the exception of my dad's sister sitting next to him, she survived with him, but Felicia, she died in 1961 of uterine cancer. So I did not meet her. So I had an understanding at a very early age that something was not right. I didn't really understand what they were killed meant, but it sounded to me like they didn't die of natural causes and that someone else had caused this. This is what, before the war, my dad's town was most famously known for, the salt mine of Velichka. And this is approximately 1911. And this is actually a photograph of the same mine. Everything you see here is made of salt. And this was actually taken between 1940 and 1945. So you can see over time, the mine was constantly being turned into an art piece in addition to being mined for its valuable salt. But the irony here is that look how beautiful this was being developed into, and this is somewhere between 40 and 45 with what's going on above ground. This is what's going on below ground. This is my father's shul. That this is a post-war photograph. The shul was desecrated by the Germans on September 7th when they entered the town, and they actually used their horses to store inside the shul. And to this day, it stands in disrepair just like this, and it's just a warehouse. It's never been resurrected or reconsecrated as a shul. But then again, it is Poland, and they're not really into rededicating a shul from the Holocaust era, at least has been my experience. This is actually a photograph from May 1939 of the young Zionist movement in my father's town, Velichka, which, you know, it was a small town of about 8,000 people, half of which were Jewish. But you wouldn't have known it if you visited it because of the virulent anti-Semitism for the 20 years before the Holocaust. But the record should show that there was a youth Zionist movement in Velichka before the war. This is the center of the town. It's Market Square on Reinik Gorny Street. And this is a photograph from the early 1900s. And the reason I want to show it to you is because I want to condition you to the architecture of the building with the steeple. This is the same building, the same marketplace in the late 1920s. This is where different vendors would market and sell their wares. However, that's the same set of buildings behind. This is a photograph that I found after I published the softcover edition. It is a photo of 43 men that have been lined up by the German Wehrmacht, and the date is between September 7th and the 11th, 1939. And as you can see, it's all men. Most of them have beards. In 1930s Poland, most men were clean shaven, which is further evidence that they targeted just Orthodox observant Jews. And when I blow the photograph up and zoom in, those blue arrows show you the German Wehrmacht as they appeared during that range of September 7th to the 11th. The thickest arrow is a gentleman that has black SS bands on his collar. And it's probably hard for you to see, but when I blow this up even further on my computer, almost all the German officers and infantrymen are smiling, which was very common in photographs taken by the Wehrmacht. When they would humiliate Jews and torture Jews, they would always take pictures of themselves smiling in front of Jews. This is another photograph that was taken by the Wehrmacht between September 7th and 11th, 1939. It's another incident where they were rounding up Orthodox Jews, making them sweep the road. And the one man that has a bucket, my father told me that the Germans, since they came on horseback into Velichka, there was so much horse dung all around the streets, they would have the Jews pick up the horse dung by hand and put them in buckets. And if there weren't enough buckets, they had to put the horse dung in their pockets. Those are my father's Polish neighbors behind watching. This became a ritual between the day of invasion on September 7th and the 11th. Poles got a kick out of this, and it became an afternoon event, and my father witnessed all of this. This is during the same time period, Germans cutting the religious payas off of an observant Jewish male, and you can kind of see through one of the truck's windows, Polish neighbors coming for a show. This picture, however, I know for a fact is September 12th, 1939. And what you're looking at here is the actual beginnings of the roundup, where they rounded up 32 Jewish men, one of which was my grandfather. They were loaded onto trucks, the trucks taken to a forest, and they were lined up and shot. And as you can see, there's a heavier presence on this day of Poles watching. I was just in Israel this past June and July, and I had been to Yad Vashem once before during the trip that I discussed in 2018. And on one of the walls, unbeknownst to me, this photograph is there. It is under a section called forced labor. And as I explained to our guide, that is not what was going on in this photograph. The Germans had lied and said that they were going to be taken away for a hard labor job. But while they were waiting for the trucks to arrive to haul 32 Jewish men away, they handed them brooms because they had conditioned them to doing this for the previous 5 days. And no one really understood that there was going to be a mass murder committed, but that had been in the works since the invasion. And you have to remember, this is September 12th. Hardly anyone knew what the Germans had in store. The Einsatzgruppen had not been distributed throughout Europe to do mobile killing units and Holocaust by bullets. None of that was in effect yet. All that had been invaded was Poland, and by the 12th, it's about half of Poland had been taken over. The idea that Jews would be rounded up and taken away somewhere and gunned down was fairly foreign and unheard of, and nothing you could guard against because it hadn't happened yet. When I blow this picture up, if you look to the far right, that's just another Jew that's being dragged or pushed in by two Germans into the center there. This photo taken by the Wehrmacht was probably taken minutes, maybe hours before my grandfather was found and brought to the same center. The list of 32 men was put together by the Polish municipality in charge at City Hall. They had recruited a Pole to help them put together the list. And people were shocked that the Germans only being in my dad's town for 5 days, how they could have come up with a list so fast. It was because they recruited Poles to help make out the list because they knew who the quote troublemakers were or resistors might be. And even though I told you most men had left Velichka at this time, a lot of Orthodox didn't, and neither did my grandfather. And these were literally the last 32 Jewish men alive left in Velichka. So that's how the list was compiled. This is actually a postcard of the train station in my dad's town. At the bottom, you can see Velichka and the date of January 1904. And the reason why I have this in the book is fairly significant because from this train station, several important things happened with respect to my father's story. One, it is the train station that Velichka Jews were trained to the death camp Belzec, which is likely how my grandmother and 3 of my dad's sisters were murdered. Some of the Jews were gunned down on that fateful day in August of 1942, when the Germans grew tired of putting Jews on trains. They slaughtered the last 800 at the train station. The second significant thing about the train station is before these deportations, my father traveled around posing as a non-Jew for 3 years without any papers. He refused to wear the Jewish Star of David armband. And because he was light-skinned with light hair and blue eyes, and the town was overcrowded with people fleeing from the north, my father was able to blend in as a small 9-year-old. And he would boldly just go to this train station, buy a ticket, and he was engaging in what was really a dry run for his survival. He was taking the train to Miehov, to Bochnia, to Krakow, just wandering around, seeing what he could get away with. At the same time, he was shopping for food because Jews were not really allowed to buy food in markets, but my father did in order to keep his family fed until he fled in 1942. This is what the back of the same train station looks like today. It's abandoned. There's no memorial or plaque there, which is what most of Poland looks like. There was so much atrocity committed throughout Poland, and Poles don't want to be reminded of it, and which is kind of odd because you would think the Germans did it, but everybody knows that the Poles were complicit with the Germans in many, many instances, and this is why they do not mark areas of significance in great number, because they don't want to be reminded, and they also want to whitewash history. And there was a great atrocity committed at this train station, and the Polish police helped seal off the city for the Germans the day of the deportation and the slaughter at the train station. This is what it looks like today from the front. Again, abandoned. They don't replace it, and there's no memorialization that whatever happened there. This is one of the only known photographs of the Miele Ghetto, a town north of Krakow. My dad stuck in and out of this ghetto several times when he had nowhere to hide, nowhere to live, nowhere to seek shelter. And then this is a photo. There are very few of the Bochnia Ghetto, which is to the east of Krakow. This was the second ghetto my father would sneak in and out of. And oddly, every time my father snuck in and out of the Miehov and the Bochnia ghettos, he either would sneak out right before there was a liquidation, which he didn't know was going to happen, or he would sneak in right after a liquidation, not knowing it had just happened. These are the main gates of the Krakow ghetto. You might recognize it from the movie Schindler's List. These are the very gates that the Schindler Jews would walk in and out of, that my father also snuck in and out of under the cover of their great number, which provided him that kind of cover. And like the Bochnia and Miehov ghettos before, he left the Krakow ghetto right before its liquidation in early 1942. Without giving away the core and heart of my father's story, my father ended up on a farm for the last 3 years of the war. He thought he was carefully hiding and working there as a non-Jew. But unbeknownst to him, up the road from the farm, there was a reconstituted World War I German fortress that he had to provide daily dairy products to as part of his job. So he thought he had escaped Krakow, and he thought running away to the countryside would get him better results without being stopped by the Gestapo, which happened in Krakow, only to arrive at this town called Babice, north of Krakow, only to find out that he had to bring products on a daily basis to the German contingency at this fortress. And these are modern day photos of what that fortress looked like. Again, World War I fortress that the Germans were using in World War II. as a potential defensive line, which ended up happening in early 45 when my father witnessed the Russians and Germans fighting at this particular fortress. This map I recently put in the book. Every dot is a ghetto, and the black arrows I drew here are the three towns and ghettos that my dad zigzagged in and out of. And you can see Velichka just a bit southeast of Krakow. That's what my dad looked like. It's a screenshot of the day that he gave the Shoah Foundation interview. I'm not allowed to show any footage from it. It is their intellectual property, but I am allowed to take a little snippet of it. And at the end of the 4 hours, they asked my mother, my brother, myself, my wife, and my son to be on camera and answer a few questions. So we did. And I should note that I'm currently working on a documentary that'll parallel the book, working with several Hollywood people that do this. And it's been a long road, but they've been able to acquire a license to be able to use the audio and video for my dad's interview in the documentary. So I'm still not allowed to do it on a personal level, so I don't. But some of it will be in the documentary. Again, I'm returning to the cover of the book because I want to isolate on the photograph of my father that I used. This photograph is my dad in Budapest, Hungary in 1945, just after the Holocaust. And that is a face that I did not know growing up. It is a face that shows bewilderment, loss, and confusion. And that is not the man that I knew. That's my father in 1948 in Belgium. This is the face of the father that I grew up with. That's my father on the SS Washington in 1951, when the United States and the UN created the Displaced Persons Act, and my father finally had a passport, a Belgian passport, to be able to come to the United States. I spent an entire chapter on this in the book. People don't realize, everyone thinks when the Holocaust ended, Jews were immediately able to come to the United States. They were not. It's a fact. No one in Europe wanted displaced refugee Jews. And then when Jews in Europe looked beyond Europe, the same was true all over South America and North America. No one wanted the Jews. And my dad didn't have a passport anymore. He didn't have his birth certificate from Poland. He had been running around on false papers. So how was he going to get a real legitimate passport to get into the United States? It took 6 years before the Displaced Persons Act was passed. And like I said, he was issued a Belgian passport, and that's him on the boat. And at the end of the trip, that's a photo of him obviously passing Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. And this is my dad's sister that survived with him, Felicia Paremba. She married, had one child, and she died in 61. And that's a photograph of my parents shortly before they got married. And that is me with my father the day after my bar mitzvah. Back then they had a reception the day after. And to think that the day before this photograph was taken, I announced to the world I was going to write a book. I had no clue how I was going to do it, or if I was going to do it, or what I was going to go through to be able to do it. But you wouldn't have known looking at me, because I was just kicking something under the rug that I didn't think I was ever going to have to deal with. And there's my father and I on the date of my wedding in 1996. So this is 2 years before my father agreed to finally have the USC Shoah Foundation over. And that's my father and my mom at my son's bar mitzvah. And then at my daughter's bar mitzvah. And then all 6 of us on the date of my daughter's bat mitzvah reception. So the point is, my father was able to continue Jewish life. He sent both of his kids to Jewish day schools, and my wife and I did the same thing with our two kids. We sent them to Jewish day schools, and both of our kids have done the Poland and Israel trip. I have not been to Poland for various reasons. I haven't exactly come to terms with wanting to do that. But lo and behold, my wife and I sent both our kids on their own respective Poland Israel trips. So I learned more from them when they returned, and that ended up springboarding into helping me come to terms and sit down and write this book. So I just want to leave you with this quote that author Primo Levi wrote in one of his books, which then Simon Wiesenthal paraphrased in his book, The Drowned and the Saved. As you know, Simon Wiesenthal survived 3 different camps, Janowska, Plaszow, which my father was in, and Gross Rosen. And between his experiences at all 3 camps, Simon Wiesenthal, he explained what the SS officers would usually tell Jews when they were brought in to replace Jews who had died in the role of performing hard labor. Wiesenthal wrote, however, this is what Nazi officers would taunt Jews with. However this war may end, we have won the war against you. None of you will be left to bear witness. But even if some of you survive, the world will not believe you. There will perhaps be suspicions, discussions, research by historians, but there will be no certainties because we will destroy the evidence together with you. And even if some proof should remain and some of you survive, people will say that the events that you describe are too monstrous to be believed. They will say they are exaggerations of Allied propaganda and will instead believe us, who will deny everything and not you. We will be the ones to dictate the history. Well, that ended up being wrong. Hundreds of thousands of survivors have shared their stories. Thousands have shared their memoirs, and I've done the same. My motivation for doing it is shared in the epilogue of the book. But one of the biggest driving forces for me has been to confront Polish complicity and denial. I go into a great deal of detail about that in explaining the anti-Semitism that my father faced before and during, but more as importantly after the Holocaust, when he returned to his town. It absolutely unbelievable. Again, I want to thank Valley Beit Midrash for having me, and I would be happy to entertain any questions or comments.
Thank you so much. Friends, you can go ahead and unmute now and ask questions. Go ahead, Lauren.
I want to thank you for bearing witness. My father was also a survivor, and he was from Krakow also. And I don't know how many people know that the Poles were actually killing Jews after the war. My father was with a Garin that was supposed to make Aliyah, and it turned out they were going by truck to Lvov to meet with other people, and my father took the train because he had bought the ticket. His friends never made it. They were murdered by Poles after the war. I wanted my father to give his story to the Spielberg group, but he wouldn't. And I think part of it was survivor's guilt. I find a lot of the ones who were not in concentration camps, my father went eastward and he wound up in the Gulag. They wouldn't tell those stories. He told the story to me, but he wouldn't he wouldn't do it on tape. But thank you so much for bearing witness. And the story has to keep being told over and over and over again. Thanks.
You're welcome. It's my honor. And I feel your father's pain because I lived with that. My father didn't want to talk about it either. If you do the math, my dad survives in 45 and he finally sits down in 98. So that's a long time not wanting to talk. And then the effect of it, like I discussed, is when I heard two little stories, I couldn't deal with it and I didn't want to hear anymore. So I certainly wasn't going to help him tell his story, but I understand where your father was coming from. And my father was a flight survivor. Sounds like your father was too. And this was the most common way to survive. Not the easiest, very little to no help, no connections, no money, no power, and just improvising on a daily basis for 6 long years. But that is how most of the Jews survived. And so my father's story is your father's story, and the majority of survivors' story, where sheer will and sheer luck are the reasons that they made it.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I've just thinking of Viktor Frankl and looking at the pictures of your father and your Aunt Felicia and just how beautiful they were. Like it. So just thinking about, just what I've read and the story that you've shared with us and everything. It's just for me, was there talk about how your father and your Aunt Felicia ever smiled again? How they ever looked that beautiful again?
Yeah, I'm not a psychologist to be able to give you a qualified answer.
Mhm.
Didn't meet my aunt, but my father was so happy-go-lucky.
Mhm.
Nothing on his sleeve told you what he went through or what he was. I'll share another trauma issue.
Mhm.
My father had a very heavy Eastern European accent. When you would meet him, it was obvious he was not from the United States. And most people would say, "Where are you from?" And because my father didn't want to talk about the past, he would just say, "I'm from New York." But people would give him a look like, "You don't sound like you're from New York. Why are you saying that?" Well, he wasn't going to explain that. Well, I'm really a Holocaust survivor and I don't want to talk about it. So, yeah, I'm from New York. I grew up seeing and feeling that awkwardness my entire life. But it's taken me this long to understand if he didn't want to talk about it to us, why was he going to talk about it to a stranger or an acquaintance saying, "Hey, where are you from?" I'm from New York. And, it was embarrassing for me growing up because obviously he didn't sound New York like a New Yorker. So couldn't understand why he kept saying that. He wasn't fooling anyone, but he did smile. I mean, my dad was a rip-off artist of vaudeville. And this is how he would entertain my brother and I without us knowing what vaudeville was. And he took that humor, and that's the humor he used in the house. He was a funny guy, and he left it all behind until the day he gave the interview. But it was very difficult. But he was still the same person afterwards, other than he now wanted to talk.
Thank you.
And Lauren is commenting that her father never smiled or laughed. Yeah, I understand that. And like I said earlier, I'm going to Hebrew private schools. I have access to dozens of survivors. They're all bigger than life, smiling, happy people, open, wanting to share. But my father's not. And what I realized, Lauren, is everyone has different DNA and everyone is going to deal with the trauma and loss differently. I mean, I would, you would. So I don't begrudge any survivor that was closed off for those reasons. Everyone's completely different, and I don't judge anyone for being open or closed off. I understand the horror. It's not, if you don't want to share it, I completely get it. And the reason is this: I put it on the front page of my website. My father didn't want to talk about this because he didn't want people to see him as a victim. He didn't want people to see him at his lowest, when he had no power or control over his life, the trajectory. So for him to talk about it reveals I have no say in my life. It's got to be the worst, and it is the worst feeling.
I have a question, Joel. Do you find yourself, and I've asked this question to other Holocaust survivors that I've had the honor to be able to talk to. Do you find yourself having a certain hate still towards the Polish?
I don't want to use the word hate, but because certainly Poland has come far. I don't think they do the Holocaust education and openness that the Germans do. But I would say in answering your question directly, I definitely feel that one of the end chapters of the book, I'm going to use the word indict. I present everything that they did that my father witnessed, and this was just done to one man and his family. It's an exemplar of what was done to 3 million Polish Jews. My father's experiences in his town before, after, and during. There's not one survivor that didn't see or experience the exact same thing. So I won't go so far as to use the word hate, but I definitely indict them in my book at the end.
Joel, I'm curious as to if you could share what you can about your children visiting Poland and their reaction, and compare it to your reluctance to go, which I understand, and how you reacted to their visit.
It's it's a complicated answer. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and as the son of a Holocaust survivor, it was always, shh, don't wear your Jewishness on your sleeve. You don't want anyone to know. My kids had the benefit of being that much further separated in time, and not to criticize, but the Hebrew day schools I went to were the same as my parents. Low key, let's not talk about being Jewish. Let's not wave it around. My kids' schools that I sent them to, again, a generation or two removed, very open, very proud of being Jewish. So when they went, they always start in Poland first to get the melancholy out of the way. And then you go to Israel where there's strength and life. They're much more open about things than I am. They're much more matter of fact and less nuanced than I am. But I know no different, because I grew up in a house where we couldn't and we didn't talk about it. I tried to bait my dad for 31 years. I would watch every Holocaust documentary, movie, docudrama, in an attempt to get my father involved. I would say, hey, did you see this? What do you think about this? Or where were you when this happened? Never would take the bait. In my house, when my kids would try to engage me, I would tell them everything I knew, which wasn't much. So it was different. I tried to be receptive to my kids and tell them everything I did know. My dad, definitely not. So it's a generational thing. The further we get away from it, the more we have to educate, but the further we get away from it, the less trauma there is passed down to generation after generation. But I went ahead and dropped my author website in the chat. You can get a lot more of my dad's story on the website. And if I'm honored enough, maybe you'll go to Amazon and buy the hardcover book to get the details of what my dad went through.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our partners, Or Tzion, and thank you so much to our great friend Joel for an amazing presentation. Everybody have an amazing day. Take care.
Thanks, Eddie. Thanks, Andre. Thank you, everyone.